So this lecture is also about the 50s, but also into the 60s as well. And the theme is the civil rights movement. And the reason it's kind of gets its start in the early 50s is because when the 50s be post World War II, with the 50s being so prosperous, there is a section of the American population left out of the prosperity, and it's generally African American, especially African American Southerners, and where segregation is still in place. Part of the reason why there's a return to protest for civil rights and equality in the 50s is because a lot of black men had hoped that fighting in World War II would have brought about equality for them to have shown that they were good citizens and very patriotic, and it really didn't have an immediate effect. So the 1950s come around, the world is a prosperous place in the United States anyway, and the segment of society is left out again. It's seen as a good opportunity to try to return to a protest movement. And part of the reason why the African American population is so dissatisfied in the 1950s is because society is very unequal. It's segregated, illegal segregation too. It's actually a law on the books, all the way back to that Plessy v. Ferguson that we talked about from 1896, where it was deemed okay, legally all right. It wasn't a violation of any amendments or constitutional rights if segregation was separate but equal. So you could legally, in the minds of many in the South, separate the black and white populations and public facilities as long as you offered separate, equal facilities for black Southerners. So it was not uncommon at all to see signs like this in the South, where it would be waiting rooms for white only or black only facilities. And the idea was it's segregated, it's keeping the population separate, apart, segregation. That's what to segregate means, is to put apart. Um, and the idea was it's separate, but there's facilities for both races. You know, if you have a white school, you have to have a black school. And the way you kept separation okay was to make sure that it was equal. And the South, it is legal. It is part of the law. By law, things are separate. Uh, Waiting rooms, public facilities like water fountains, hotels, restaurants, everything is legally segregated in the South. And the North is not, there's not like legal segregation in many places, but a lot of places where they had like a custom of segregating where northern hotels could ban black patrons. Same thing with restaurants. Notoriously, like the casinos in Las Vegas were segregated for quite some time, even though it wasn't considered the Deep South. So there's a custom of segregation or barring non-white patrons in a lot of places, even if it's not the law. It was just sort of socially accepted. No one was going to raise an issue with it if a hotel in New York City was for whites only. I mean, not like it would happen today. And there were also a lot of separate schools in the North and the South where there was white schools and black schools. And it was the separate school issue that first really saw a concerted effort to desegregate and to get rid of the separate schools. And this comes to a head in 1954 with the Supreme Court case called Brown versus Board of Education. And what happens with this one is that this really starts to kick off a civil rights movement, a movement in the 50s to try to get rid of segregation in public facilities. And it starts with the schools. The Supreme Court justice at the time, one of them was Thurgood Marshall, and he hoped that school segregation would be a good place to start getting rid of full segregation. What happens here, why it's called Brown versus Board, is because it's the versus it was called Board. Brown is one of the individuals involved, but Board was the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education, and they were resisting attempts to end segregation. So it kind of this is the becomes the classic case, like the example case of this is where they're going to try to desegregate schools. There was issues with it trying to do that in Kansas, so they brought it to the Supreme Court. And part of the reasons why school segregation seemed to be a good place to attack if you wanted to end segregation, if you were against it, you wanted to stop segregation. It seemed like a good place to start because the schools were probably the most obvious place where there was separation and it was unequal. It was very apparent to many people that black and white schools were very unequal, that black schools were not funded as well, that they had less materials, not as many resources, not weren't kept up quite as well as the white schools, and you could kind of see it in pretty clearly, not very good textbooks, no microscopes for the science classes. They weren't as well appointed as white high schools, especially. And so a lot of the arguments against continued school segregation was that you could see that separate but equal wasn't working in the unequal funding that they received and unequal support, which meant that there were worse opportunity. There were not as many opportunities for black students going off and getting their education. But also a big argument that is made during the Brown v. Board case was that even if you could somehow make schools equal in funding, separation was always going to be a bad thing because it left a lot of psychological damage, especially to black children. The idea was that separation would always sort of reinforce a feeling of inferiority in them, that they had to be kept away from the white students and sort of tucked away. They were dangerous or unworthy or something. So there was no way in the world you could ever have this and not cause psychological damage to these children. And it ends up being a persuasive argument, and the case of Brown v. Board is successful in banning segregation in public schools, so that becomes a law of the land that schools have to be open to anybody in the district. If you live near a school, how school districts work, you kind of go to school near where you live. Doesn't matter if you're black or white, if you're in that district, that's your public school that you go to. Private schools are a different entity, but public schools are desegregated in the Brown v. Board 1954 case. Separate but equal ends up being ruled unconstitutional because it is the 14th Amendment states that all citizens need to equally be protected by the law, and separation of schools seem to violate that, where you couldn't protect your citizens if they are in separate schools like that. Um, so it's hailed as a very big early success for African Americans looking to enhance their civil rights and enjoy more equality in society, because it does end school segregation. A lot of schools hang on. They just, in certain states in the South, they refuse to desegregate, but the law of the land is that segregation is banned in schools, and it's considered a very good early victory, and it kind of galvanizes the civil rights movement. A lot of Black Southerners, especially, who want to um, remove the rest of segregation. It kind of gives them some fuel for the fire to keep going and want to desegregate other public places, not just the schools. Um, there is the next kind of big concerted effort is an attempt to desegregate public transportation because buses were segregated, where you would have black and white buses or black and white sections on buses. And a lot of African Americans felt that, that was the next thing that had to go because it affected them a lot. You were generally slightly less well off than the white population, so they relied more heavily on public transportation and felt that that was something to focus on. But the push to desegregate buses has kind of a very interesting story behind it. There were a lot of protests, including boycotting riding segregated transportation, um, especially in the South. And probably one of the first cases, the least well known of the cases of the attempt to boycott and change the segregated bus system, was the story of Claudette Colvin. In March 1955, she was a 15-year-old girl, and she in the Deep South, she refused to give up her seat on a crowded bus to a white passenger and was punished for it. She was arrested for violating the segregation law, but nothing really comes of Claudette Colvin's case. This is, I'm sure, hopefully that story of a black woman saying no to giving up a bus seat should strike you as somewhat familiar. But this story doesn't really go anywhere. In March 1955, like nothing really happens. It's just considered kind of just par for the course of every once in a while someone would violate segregation. The reason why there's not a lot that happens after Claudette Colvin refuses to give up a bus seat is because Claudette Colvin, unfortunately for her, I suppose, she is not really someone that Black Southerners want to rally around as the leader of a cause or the leader of a protest movement because she's extremely young. She's only 15. And she is also just considered not a good poster child for the civil rights movement. She's also pregnant at this time. So she's a very young, pregnant, out of wedlock teenager. And the civil rights movement, the growing effort amongst Black Southerners to fight for civil rights, they are very, very concerned with respectability, with showing a good face, with being just very clean cut, very above board, very respectable, very middle class kind of image they were trying to portray of themselves. And rallying around a pregnant teenager was not really the image they wanted to portray. That's not how they wanted the movement to be seen. They wanted to have, a movement not sparked by this. So there was not really a concerted effort to start a bus boycott because of Claudette Colvin. The one who gets all the attention is Rosa Parks, and she does the exact same thing in Montgomery, Alabama, and this is seen as a way to start up a protest movement against the segregated buses. And I tell this story because it's a lot of it is seen as very kind of instantaneous, off the cuff, very serendipitous stuff that starts the civil rights movement. But the civil rights movement and civil rights organizing was very planned out. It wasn't as spontaneous as a lot of people think. Rosa Parks's actions were kind of planned, really, because Rosa Parks was a great figure. In December 1955, a few months after Claudette Colvin, Rosa Parks does the same thing. She refuses to give up her seat on a segregated bus, and her arrest and her mistreatment because of that action is used by reformers in the South to launch a bus boycott, where the people of Montgomery, Alabama, if you support it, especially the black population, refuses to ride city buses, and it costs the city a lot of money in an effort to force them to desegregate. They say, okay, you boycott, you stop buying something, you stop paying something. If you're going to boycott a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, that means you're not going to give them money. People start walking to work, and they say, we're going to keep walking to work and we're going to keep not riding the buses until you desegregate them, until you make them equal. Rosa Parks was an NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That's what that stands for. She was a leader in that organization and she was very politically active. But she is a good figure to rally behind for the bus boycott because she's got a lot going for her. She's middle-aged. She's extremely respectable. She has a good job. She's married, very motherly, and it's the perfect storm. She is arrested, and look at her mugshot. I mean, it's like that's like your favorite aunt being dragged off a bus and arrested for not moving. The story is really kind of spun as she was just a simple seamstress with tired feet who had finally had enough of being told to move aside. But it was very strategically planned that, when that happened, everybody kind of knew that they were gonna rally around Rosa Parks because of her influence. And it sparks the Montgomery bus boycott. And for over almost a year, the black community in the South either walked or carpooled to work, and eventually cost the city of Montgomery, Alabama, enough money by them not using the city buses that they finally just say, forget it. We're not segregating the buses anymore. This is really expensive. You guys are really dedicated to this. And the buses are desegregated. And it shows that nonviolence could work, that this respectable policy of civil disobedience and just boycotting stuff could bring about change. In this case, ending segregation on public buses. And it was clear by this time that something really did need to be done because it wasn't just segregation that was an issue in the South, the idea of just separate buses and separate schools, there was still a lot of violence going on. There was still a lot of mistreatment of Black Southerners, not just being denied equal schools or having to ride a segregated bus. And the case of Emmett Till really drove this point home. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, and he was in the South. He was down in the deep South visiting family. And part of the tragedy here is that having lived in Chicago, lived in the North, Emmett Till didn't really have the same knowledge of how to operate in a segregated society as us as Black Southerners who lived there their whole lives. And the story is a little vague. Supposedly, he whistles at a white woman named Carolyn Bryant. Um, the other kind of version of the story is that she made that whole thing up. There's a lot of questions going on about what exactly happened, what Emmett Till actually did when he was down in the South. Um, the what the story goes is that later on, the woman Carolyn Bryant kind of redacted her statement that he'd whistled at her, or flirted with her, or done something to her. But regardless of what actually went down, whether or not Emmett Till did anything, Carolyn Bryant tells her, I think it's her husband and her brother-in-law, that this black teenager had insulted her in some way. And what they do is the men, they kidnap him, they beat him to death, he's killed, and they throw his body in a river. And the body is almost unrecognizable when it's finally recovered. Um, Emmett Till's mother has his body returned to Chicago, and instead of just, burying him and letting the issue lie, she actually has an open casket funeral where she invites people to come through. And I think the saying is, let them look at what they did to my boy. She wanted to make sure that this would be very, very apparent, that she wanted to showcase what had happened to her son for having vaguely misstepped, possibly in the South. That, like, this is what awaited any black Southerner who stepped out of line and even was suspected vaguely of disrespecting someone in the white South. So over 100,000 people come to look at Emmett Till's body, and it's extremely disfigured what they did to him and how badly he was treated. So it's considered a very brave thing what she did, to have had to endure that, having her son killed and then having to see what he had suffered and have others see it. But it raised a lot of awareness for how bad the social situation still was in the South. Um, a lot of a lot of people are also sort of rally to the support of the civil rights movement and the idea that something really does need to change after having seen this. Um, Part of what makes people very angry about the Emmett Till murder is that, he was very young, probably didn't even really do anything. And the fact that the two men who they admitted to kind of kidnapping him and beating him to death, they are found not guilty after a deliberation of like 60 minutes. So it's seen as them getting away with murder. So it really further galvanizes the civil rights movement and the need for change. And with the idea that something needed to happen in the South, the idea is how. That's the big question. How? How do you change things um, when you have such violence and what to do? But a lot of leaders of movements attempting to end segregation and bring about equality were determined that no matter how much violence they were met with, they were not going to rise to the bait, really. That the nonviolence of the bus boycott had shown that that could work, that you could use nonviolent methods to try to bring about change. And one of the organizations that was really a champion of this idea was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, really rolls off the tongue. But the SCLC is, as it kind of implies, it's a Southern group of African American ministers, Christians. It's a religious organization as well, and they are dedicated to advocating for an end to segregation. So their whole thing is ending segregation in the South, anywhere it exists, and it's mostly well known for its very very powerful leader in Dr. Martin Luther King, who was a reverend, and his big the thing that he's most well known for is advocating for nonviolence and civil disobedience to bring about change. So peaceful protests, uh, boycotts like the Montgomery bus boycott, very, very, very steeped in Christianity, where you turn the other cheek, no matter how much you're abused. Um, Very, very peaceful, where you never, ever, ever give your enemy another reason to hate you. You do everything through the proper channels, and everything was to be done legally. They wanted to end legal segregation, and they wanted to make sure that they were doing it all the right way to win more support for their cause too. They felt that it made them very sympathetic to see people getting beat up and not raising a hand to fight back. So nonviolence means, never being violent, but civil disobedience means that if you're going to draw attention to something, you're going to just do something that aggravates people but isn't really either illegal or wrong, kind of like the bus boycott, where that's civil disobedience, where you just stop taking the bus. So a lot of boycotts, a lot of protest movements that were, as long as you weren't burning things down or beating anybody up, you were raising awareness for a cause by simply being somewhere you maybe you shouldn't, trying to forcefully desegregate places like Rosa Parks did. Anything but violence, really. And the movement is considered quite slow, and Dr. King is all about like you just gotta hold on, have that Christian fortitude and patience. And the Montgomery bus boycott takes a year of walking to work before it works. And a lot of younger people, they like the nonviolence, but they are a little dissatisfied with the slowness of it. So younger people try to take things into their own hands. One of the groups that emerges in the South to try to end segregation is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC or SNCC. And that rolls off the tongue a little nicer, doesn't it? You can tell young people put that one together. They thought that one through. Um, but what SNCC was younger people. That's what made it very different from other organizations, is that it was young activists who wanted to fight for empowerment and fight against racial injustice. And some of the things that make SNCC different from Dr. King and the SCLC was that SNCC was much younger. Again, it was a lot of students, young people. They wanted to see quick change. They didn't want to kind of plod around like their dull old parents and just wait for things to get better. Um, SNCC is generally a lot more. Um, they're more overt with what they do. They want to draw attention to what they do. They're also a lot more racially integrated, so there's more white students involved in the SNCC because let's face it, the older generation at this time was probably a lot of older white Americans were not really as involved in the civil rights movement, but younger white people were. Like young white students, college students are feel like they're much more open to new ideas, so they're willing to join SNCC or something like this and help out other people their age overcome inequality. Um, and SNCC is definitely someone that they're willing to kind of push the boundaries a little bit more. They're willing to go a little bit further maybe than Dr. King would like sometimes. Break a few more laws, but they were dedicated to nonviolence as well. That's part of their name is the Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Um, they were just a little bit more showy, perhaps, and willing to kind of push boundaries a bit. And this is kind of examples of what the SNCC students would do. And SNCC members, this is one of the things that they were known for doing and taking part in was something called a sit-in. This is one of the most famous of the nonviolent type of protests, where how do you protest a segregated lunch counter? You sit there even though you're not supposed to, and you wait to be served even though you probably never will, and you get abused by people around you. Little bit of background about this. During the 1950s, back in the day, a lot of places like convenience stores, like a Walgreens, would have places where you could shop, but they also had a lunch counter. So it was a place you could sit down. like a diner in the store, and you could order food. And a lot of these in the South were segregated, where if you were black, you could go in the store, you could buy stuff. They'll take your money. You could even order something at the lunch counter, some places, but you weren't allowed to sit and be served and eat it there. You had to eat outside or not at all. You know, you that was kind of the only thing you could do is maybe order your food to go. So this was something that the students really took up as their cause, was they wanted to desegregate lunch counters and places where people could eat. And um, so what they did to stick to their nonviolent thing is they didn't go in there and trash the place. What the the SNCC members would do is they would simply sit at a lunch counter and wait to be served, and their presence there was a protest to segregation. So you see here there's a young female black student sitting there at a counter that was for whites only, and she's surrounded by white members of SNCC because, as I mentioned in the last slide, SNCC was a bit more racially integrated than the SCLC, the older people like Dr. King. So you had a lot of white students too. So they would, in solidarity with their black friends, they would sit down and try to wait to be served at this counter, and that was their form of protest. And what happened at sit-ins usually is they would sit there for hours, hours and hours, and wait to be served, and nobody would because they weren't allowed to. But their presence there would draw usually crowds, and they sat there and got absolutely abused. The sit-in, the students later, years later, being interviewed a lot, and even just watching what happened a lot of times is the people would sit down at the lunch counters and crowds would come and start jeering at them, and they would pour food on them and hit them, smack them, scream at them, jostle them, rip them off the chairs, pull their like the back of their shirt down and pour ice down it. And the idea was you just sat there and you took it. You didn't fight back, you didn't yell, you just sat there and you just turned the other cheek. And that was a you did not want to egg anybody on. You were the like the good guy at the if you did that. If you could just endure it, that showed a lot of fortitude on your part. It gained a lot of sympathy. And it showed that your enemy was just very childish. I mean, someone's sitting there, they just want to eat lunch, and you're dumping coffee on them. It made white Southerners who were opposed to ending segregation seem very unreasonable and very silly. So it was a very good tactic that the young people had, and it brought a lot of publicity for their cause. Very splashy, kind of a little bit more splashy maybe than Dr. King's stuff, but it did help really bring attention to the cause. Another thing young people were very much into, just like the sit-ins, SNCC members sought other nonviolent protests, including freedom rides, which is where they would try to forcefully integrate buses and train stations. What happened a lot of times is black and white protesters would board buses from the north where they weren't segregated, and they'd ride them all the way to the south where bus terminals, bus waiting stations were segregated, and try very hard to just draw attention to how kind of ridiculous it was to segregate a bus station, really, or a terminal. Um, a lot of so it's basically like a sit-in on a at a bus station. Because some buses were desegregated, a lot of buses were desegregated, but the terminals weren't. So the freedom rides were a lot of people coming from the north down to the south to try to just flood the bus terminals with protesters. And they called them freedom rides because it was a lot of Northerners, a lot of people who in the North who supported the civil rights movement. And they were met with a lot of violence too, because a lot of Southerners felt that this, like, get out of here. You're from the North. You don't even know what happens in the South. Like this is not your battle. Some of them were killed. There were especially a lot of violence against the white freedom riders, because white Southerners saw them as just absolute traitors. Like, how dare you, how dare you do this? But it just like the people beating up the sit-in protesters, killing freedom riders just only served to show the South as violent and unreasonable. So it really starts to change the narrative here, where Americans seeing this on the news, reading this in the newspapers, get more sympathy and support for the protesters because of how just peaceful they are. They're just so docile, and everybody beating them up just looks so rabid and immature by comparison. One of the next things that happens, kind of going by event here, is the effort to force desegregation in schools brings the civil rights issue to the living rooms of America because they start to see it on their TVs. So there's a huge thing that happens in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. So, as you know, having just like 5 minutes ago watched the slide about Brown v. Board, public schools had to be desegregated, which meant black and white kids have to go to school together now. That's the law of the land. That's what Brown v. Board did. A lot of schools really dragged their feet, though, especially in the South. They did not want to do that. They did not want to have black and white children going to school together. There was a lot of um, resistance in white communities of integrating or mixing the schools. And in Little Rock, Arkansas, the governor there, Orville Faubus, which is the best name ever, Orville Faubus or Faubus, decided that he was going to overrule the Supreme Court ruling in his state, and he was going to use the state militia to prevent the school from being integrated. He was going to prevent desegregation and keep the black high schoolers out of the school. So he bars their entry, and a lot of people in Little Rock hail him as a hero. Governor Faubus is saving the white race. He's a great guy. It's fantastic. And but he's breaking the law. So President Dwight D. Eisenhower says, "You know what? I'm sick of this little guy down in Arkansas thumbing his nose at the law of the land. School segregation is wrong." So President Eisenhower is forced to intervene. And what President Eisenhower does, he's a military man. He doesn't screw around. He sends the 101st Airborne Infantry Division in to get rid of the state militia and escort 9 high schoolers into the school. So he is not screwing around. If you ever seen like the Special Band of Brothers, that 101st Airborne like parachute infantry, that's them. That it was the same infantry that was like fighting against the Nazis in Germany. So Eisenhower, he's not playing a soft game here. He's not messing around. He sends in the 101st Airborne troops. They escort these high schoolers past screaming, rabid crowds of like white mothers in little 1950s dresses talking about, how dare you send these black kids to school with my kids? And what happens is every high school student had to have one of these soldiers with them in class to protect them from the other white students, to protect them from the crowds that gathered outside of Little Rock High School. And it was just an absolute madhouse. Um, the one of the girls pictured here, she wrote a kind of a memoir about her experience, and she said her soldier's name was Danny, and he escorted her everywhere. And she said, I would have been killed if it wasn't for Danny, because the students would like trap me in the bathroom and light toilet paper on fire and throw it in my stall and do anything they could to try to hurt me. And what happens though is the publicity is atrocious because this is all televised. People are seeing it on TV, and the United States, especially people in the North, are like, you have got to be kidding me. These are like teenagers, and you got full-grown adults screaming obscenities at them and talking about killing them to the point where you have to have the military, like World War II veterans even, escorting these kids to school. It's horrible, horrible publicity because this is, remember, the Cold War. And who is also watching? Who's always watching? The Soviet Union. And this is the best propaganda they could have ever hoped for. Look at the United States. You think they're good? They need military soldiers to escort their black population to school because the white population is that rabid. How do you have any justification for being a above board society when this is what is going on? It's another thing that, and then the students, the Little Rock Nine, as they're known, there's 9 high schoolers. They're very good at what they do because they are very demure, very quiet. They don't fight back. They just want to go to school, and it gains even more sympathy. It just keeps making the more violent white Southerners seem just so unreasonable and just ridiculous that they're starting to lose any credibility they had. People start thinking, so what if a high school is integrated? Like clearly racial animosity has turned these people absolutely rabid. Something has to change. But a big thing is the Cold War. Who wants, if you're in the United States, you're trying to make yourself look awesome and the Soviets look bad, this is not what you want. You do not want the biggest news story of the day to be soldiers escort 15-year-old girl to school so that white people don't kill her. And going on with this, even more bad publicity happens in Birmingham, not too many years later here. Um, the TV was a really great medium for civil rights activists because they knew that what was happening in their city or their town would be viewed worldwide. Um, and what happens here is in Birmingham, Alabama, there was a lot of protest marches and just general activity, sort of peaceful protests in Birmingham, Alabama. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King, sent some students out to protest continued unequal education and various issues in schools. And what happens is in 1963, the peaceful marchers are met with extreme violence from the Birmingham Police Department and Fire Department. They're marching on the streets with their signs, and the Birmingham Police and Fire Department set dogs on them. They spray them with fire hoses, which hurts. It's not just like a garden hose. Like that's a lot of pressure there. You can like rip skin off with a fire hose if you spray it at people. And they just absolutely terrorize the protesters. The Birmingham attacks and protests um, are broadcast on television, and people are horrified to see this, to see grown adults turning fire hoses and dogs on children and people who are protesting um, for a better education and for ending segregation. So it makes a lot of businesses in the city very angry because they're like, nobody wants to shop in my store if they think Birmingham is this racist nightmare. So there's a lot of press push to end the segregation. It helps desegregate a lot of businesses in Birmingham, and it pushes the United States even further into realizing that you can't just get away with this anymore because everything's on TV now. It's like today, where everything's on social media. You can't hide what you do. You can't hide something that happens in one city, one town. It's gonna go viral. This is doing the equivalent of that in the 60s. So it showed that the nonviolent stuff was still working because when nonviolence is met with violence, who's going to be the more sympathetic party? And the Birmingham demonstration showed that pretty well. So looking at politics here too, the president president in office during during this era too is John F. Kennedy. And John F. Kennedy is extremely concerned with the fighting the Cold War and fighting it well. So he doesn't really get involved too much in the early 60s with the civil rights movement because President Kennedy is a Cold War warrior. He's concerned with foreign policy, nukes, missiles, Russia, that type of stuff. And he's just cool with letting local leaders handle stuff in the South. He's in after Eisenhower. He's like, you know what, just let the military can handle what they have to. Um, let leaders do what they have to do. He's just not very involved in trying to do like in domestic social change. He's a foreign policy guy. And but what happens is, you have the Birmingham thing, the Little Rock and Birmingham make the US look really bad. And the Soviet Union is using it against the United States as this absolute racist nightmare land. So John F. Kennedy definitely starts to perk up his attention around 1963 with the Birmingham protests, where he feels that like, uh-oh, that looked awful. The Soviets are blasting this all over the globe about how violent our southern states are. This is terrible. But what really starts to make John F. Kennedy turn his gaze inward and worry about social change in the United States was because he realizes that, oops, having segregated facilities is really hurting his ability to make alliances with newly independent African nations that he's trying to woo and win over. Because what's going on here is that Kennedy is playing the Cold War game of have more allies than your enemy does. You want as many people in your party, in your camp, as humanly possible, because that's the way you're going to win the war and beat the Soviets, is you have to have the most friends. You don't want nations to fall to communism. You don't want nations to be allies of the Soviet Union. You just have to outwit them and have more buddies and have more friends than they do. So Kennedy's goal was, okay, after the Second World War, a lot of the big nations like France and Europe couldn't hold on, France and England couldn't hold on to their African colonies that they had. So they grant them independence. A lot of these countries have been pushing for that for many years to not be colonies of the British or the French anymore. And now they're independent. They're their own country. Places like Ghana, Kenya, and they are like, ooh, okay, now that we're an independent nation, we better have some allies. Who do we want? Who's going to be our a better friend and supporter of us as a nation? The Soviets or the United States? And Kennedy's like, oh my gosh, pick me, pick me. He wants them to all pick the United States and be buddies with the US because he's thinking if we have all these African nations as allies, it will protect them. We can use their resources in exchange. You don't want people turning to communism. Every ally of them is a loss for us. So Kennedy is very eager to win over these new nations as allies because they have autonomy now and they have plenty of resources, and that's just how the game works. And when you're a Cold War warrior like Kennedy, um, but he's having trouble. He's having trouble winning over places like Ghana because when their ambassadors and their diplomats come over to the United States, they're not even allowed to eat in the same restaurant as Kennedy would be. So that's a problem. Kennedy realizes that, oh my goodness, I'm not making friends when I invite this diplomat over from Ghana and he's can't stay in any hotel. He's not allowed to ride the bus if he wanted to. He's not allowed to eat in a restaurant or go to a play or do anything. And that looks terrible. Why should this man want to ally with a country where he's not even allowed um to shop in the same store as a white Southerner? So it makes the US look really terrible internationally. And Kennedy starts to realize this when he starts trying to win over various African nations. So he pushes very hard for a bill to end segregation and a bill to really codify more civil rights because he's thinking this move, this whole segregation inequality thing is costing us alliances on a global scale. Segregation has to be a thing of the past. We have to kind of move beyond dividing our own population here. However, John F. Kennedy does not really get to do too much more in office because he's assassinated in November 1963, and his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, ends up taking office after the assassination of Kennedy. Um, it's quite a moment, one of those things where it's like, ask your parents or grandparents. They'll remember exactly where they were when Kennedy was assassinated. But for the sake of this lecture, the big impact that Kennedy's assassination has is it makes Kennedy kind of like this martyr where people feel so bad that he's been assassinated. He was very pretty young for a president. And it makes it feel like he left a lot of unfinished business. So Lyndon Johnson kind of really is able to push through a Civil Rights Act in honor of JFK because John F. Kennedy had been so motivated to try to do that and hadn't gotten the chance. So it does kind of Johnson was able to push this through as a kind of in memory of Kennedy thing. He passes the Civil Rights Act. And part of it is because, well, Lyndon Johnson was his vice president, so he agreed with a lot of what Kennedy did. But so that's partially why he wants to push it through. He does agree with civil rights, much like Kennedy had come around to the idea too. But Johnson was even more of a domestic policy guy than the president was. Now that Johnson is president, he was always more domestic minded than Kennedy, and he is able to push through a lot of domestic stuff because Lyndon Johnson, in the beginning of his unexpected presidency, he is really into doing domestic reform. So he's able to do this when he becomes president. He passes something known as the Great Society, which is a healthcare program where it was all about healthcare for the poor and the elderly through things like Medicare and Medicaid. And he also starts to push for something known as the War on Poverty, where he wanted to provide more opportunities for poorer Americans to learn skills and get jobs, and implements things like food stamps, um, which has kind of changed name over the years, but essentially it's food assistance. And Johnson's whole thing was he was going to fight the Cold War by just creating even more domestic prosperity for everybody to make sure that nobody was really left out like they had been during the 50s. So that Civil Rights Act that Lyndon Johnson, he's known as LBJ. There's a lot of acronym presidents. You notice that we had FDR, JFK, now LBJ, but Lyndon Baines Johnson. LBJ signs into law that 1964 Civil Rights Act in honor of Kennedy. And what happens is in 1964, this Civil Rights Act that he pushes through for Kennedy basically just prohibits discrimination based on race or sex in employment and public settings. So it kind of is a blanket bill to get rid of a lot of segregation and inequality that had been fought against for so long. Um, so anywhere public, like a school, a hospital, a business, bus station, things like that, um, it is able to be passed so that it kind of covers a lot of what the protesters had been eager for. So but Johnson, I mentioned he's a domestic reform kind of guy. He was like, yes, a Civil Rights Act, but he's also thinking about other type of stuff, other type of things, not just desegregation. He's also in the mood to make sure that voting rights are secured as well, because that had been another issue of civil rights activists, was not just ending segregation, but also making sure that all Americans had equal access to the polls, because there had been a lot of things that had been preventing that. Um, and Johnson gets his opportunity to do this in 1965 when there was a protest in Selma, Alabama for more access to the polls for everybody. And of course, they're a peaceful protest march. They're met with a lot of violence. Same thing happens as the past two protests I talked about, where the protesters are pretty calm, the detractors are kind of unhinged, and it just breeds even more sympathy for the protesters. So Johnson uses this as an opportunity to sign into law the Voting Rights Act, which does help expand access in the South um, to the polls for everybody. What it does is it releases funding for more officials to register voters, so you have more people out there that can register you to vote, and just to monitor the polls and just, be there. Like you go, if you've ever, I don't know if anybody here's ever voted, but if you ever gone with your parents when they go vote, there's people working there at the polling stations. It's not just an empty room where you stick a piece of paper in a jar. There are a lot of officials there who have been certified and trained and monitoring the polls. So it pays for more people to do that, to just sort of monitor the polling stations and keep order and check you in and register you to vote, things like that. Um, there's also the Voting Rights Act also eliminates things like literacy tests and anything else vestigial that was sticking around that might hamper a citizen's ability to cast a ballot. Because that had been a thing in the South for quite some time, where to be eligible to vote, you had to pass a sort of literacy test that was really designed to prevent Black Southerners from voting. Costs involved in voting, anything like that was eliminated. The only things left that for voting was you still had to be a certain age, and you had to be a citizen. But it took away a lot of the other hindrances that kept people from casting a vote. And this was seen as another step in the right direction by many, because if everybody can vote, then you like to think that the winners of various political elections and whatnot will be much more representative of the majority of the population, which is how everybody hopes that a democracy works, is the majority picks the person that will represent that majority to the best of their ability. So that's a lot of the civil rights movement part of the 60s, 50s and 60s, sort of really brought to a head by the exclusion of Black Southerners from the prosperity of the 50s and even of the 60s. And that kind of is a big thing in the 60s. The 60s are seen as quite turbulent as opposed to the 50s. You know, the 50s, if people are kind of growing unhappy during the 50s, the 60s is when it all kind of bursts out. And the civil rights movement in the United States is one big social change, social movement, social unrest of the 60s, but there's a lot else. The 60s are just absolutely cramped, jam-packed with turmoil, really. A lot of it grows out of the 50s, such as the civil rights movement. And another thing we'll talk about soon, another issue of the 1960s is, of course, going to be some foreign policy problems, most notably the growing war in Vietnam that the United States gets itself involved in.